It is again time to apply what we learned. In the last course sections, we did learn about sending HTTP requests, and we did learn about forms and handling user input. In this course section, we'll continue working on this food order application, on this food delivery application, on which we started working a couple of sections ago already. And we are going to add a form and we are going to add HTTP requests, because this course section is about applying what we learned to this food order app. And therefore, we are going to add a basic checkout form where we can enter our name and address once we click on the order button. We also then want to submit that entered data to a backend, so to a server with a HTTP request. We probably also want to validate the user input on the client before we submit it. And we also want to fetch some data from a server, from a backend. We want to fetch the meals data. So the data here for these dummy meals which we got, which is currently hard-coded into the JavaScript files, that data should move to a backend as well and should be fetched from there. Now, when I say backend, I still mean Firebase, of course. We used this as a dummy backend before, and we can still use it here. Here I will use my existing project which I got, and I'll use the real-time database there. If you create a new project, make sure that you also do start with the real-time database. And of course, make sure that you did go through the HTTP section and so on. There, I'll clear any existing data which I have. And you want to make sure that under rules, you have read and write set to true so that you can send requests to that database successfully. Now, how to work with the database, that is something I did show before in the HTTP section. Now, in this module, we are going to implement these features here step by step together, but this also is a great chance for you to practice what you learned. So definitely try that on your own first. Try implementing all those features on your own first. Move that dummy data to Firebase manually. You can add data manually here to Firebase. So move that dummy data to Firebase. And once the data is there, implement these three main features to this food delivery app on your own. Try it on your own first, and thereafter, from the next lecture on, you can check my approach to compare it to yours, to solve problems if you got stuck in between, and to then simply build this together with me. So, were you successful? If you didn't try it on your own, definitely consider trying it on your own. Practicing what you learned is an important aspect of learning React. Either way, we're now going to implement these features together. And I will actually start with fetching the meals data, even though that's the bottommost point here. But I will start with that because I think it makes sense that we are able to load that data from a server, from a backend. For this, in the Firebase real-time database console, I'll add a new node manually, and I will name it meals. And then click this plus again here to add some nested data. And then I just want to add my meals data to Firebase here. Now for this, I'll start by giving every meal an ID here. So I'll just use M1 as a key. And then the value for that will be the nested data for that meal. With that, I'm kind of replicating that Firebase data structure we saw in the HTTP section for the dummy data I got here. So for the meal with the ID M1, I want to have a name field and a value of sushi, a description field with this value, and a price field with this value. So let's start with the name field here and enter sushi as a value and click add. And now this entry was added. Now we can add more nested data to this M1 meal by clicking this plus and adding the description field, where I then enter a description like this and click add, and add a price field, which is this value, which has this value. So let's enter that. Okay, so with that, we got the first meal. Now let's click on the plus here next to meals, and let's add a new meal with a different ID, M2, and then click on this plus here to add the nested data like the name, and that will then be schnitzel here in my case. Click add, and then then add the description here, which is this text here, like this. And let's add the price field with a value of 16.5. So now we got the second meal added. And I'll continue doing that. You can, of course, fast forward here if I'm boring you. I will now add the third meal with a name of barbecue burger, like that. Click add, and then also add the description here, American, raw, and meaty. And also add a price for that third meal here. So let's add a price field like this. And now there's only one more meal to go, the green bowl. For that, I'll add a new meal with an ID of M4. Click the plus, and for the name field, it's now green bowl. For the description field, I will now add this description here, like this. And then last but not least, for the price field, it's $18.99. And with that, all the data is on this Firebase server. And of course, if we were the owner of this food delivery service, we could be administrating the data here. Now let's work on this front end and let's fetch that data from that server. So here in available meals, I now no longer want to use the dummy meals array. So I now want to get rid here of dummy meals and instead fetch data from Firebase. And we learned how that works. For this, we can use the built-in fetch API, which is built into the browser. So this fetch function exists out of the box. We could also use a custom HTTP hook, for example, the one which we built in the HTTP section, but here I will build it from scratch again. Though if you want to use a custom hook or want to build a custom hook or use some third-party HTTP hook package, that would of course also be okay. But I want to build it from scratch here, so I'll write the fetch function from scratch, and I want to fetch my meals data when this component is loaded. And we learned that we can utilize the useEffect hook for this. So we can import useEffect from React to trigger a side effect like fetching data from the web when some data changes, or for example, when that component is loaded for the first time. So here I'll set up useEffect and the effect function that should be triggered. And then in there we can call fetch like this. Now here we want to send an HTTP request to this meals node here. So to this Firebase URL and then this meals node. So the full URL is this Firebase URL, which I grabbed here, and then meals.json. .json is something Firebase specific, which we have to add. So with that, we're sending a request to this REST API endpoint, which Firebase exposes here, and we're sending this request to fetch the meals. We could configure this request, as you learned, with a second argument passed to fetch, but there we could, for example, change the HTTP method and so on, and we don't really want to do that here. We want to stick to the default GET request, so this is fine. Now, fetch returns a promise, since sending such a HTTP request is an asynchronous task. Hence, we can add then here to provide a function, this function here, which is triggered when the request is done, once we got a response. Or we use async await. For this, we need to turn this into an async function so that we can use the await keyword here. But here we have to be careful. And actually, we even get a warning here. At least you might get one depending on your project setup. The function you pass to useEffect should not return a promise. Instead, you learned that the function you pass to useEffect may return a cleanup function which can be executed. You learned about that in the module where I introduced useEffect. That cleanup function should run synchronously though. It should not return a promise or anything like this. Hence, this overall function which we pass to useEffect must not be turned into an async function. Instead, if you want to use async await instead of useEffect, simply create a new function in here, fetch meals, like this, and use async here, and put your code, this line of code, into this nested inner function. And then just execute fetch meals as part of useEffect. By doing it that way, this function is still executed and you can still use async await, but the overall useEffect function does now not return a promise. It's now not an async function because we have not added async here, which would not be allowed. So that's a little workaround around that restriction, which is absolutely fine though. So now with that, we can use async await to get a response here for fetching our meals. And then you learned that for fetch, we can parse data. We get our response data by calling response.json, which also returns a promise. Hence, we also have the await keyword here. So that's how we can get the response data which we're fetching, and then we can utilize that response data. Now, the response data we're getting in the case of Firebase, and that's something Firebase specific, will always be an object where these IDs here, M1, M2, M3, M4, will be keys, and then the values for those keys will be nested objects with those properties. Hence, what we get back here, response data, will be an object, and I want an array. Therefore, we need to transform this. So we can create a new constant loaded meals, which is an empty array. And then we use a for in loop to go through all the keys in response data. So in this response data object. And the keys will be these IDs here. And the values for those keys will then be the nested objects, as I just explained. So here we then want to reach out to loaded meals and push a new object into this initially empty array, where we, for example, set the ID property. We need to set ID here because we do expect our meals to have an ID field. So we should make sure that we transform the loaded data such that we do have an ID field. And then we can set ID equal to key because, as I just mentioned, the key will be the ID of the individual meals we're fetching. Now, we also need to set a name, the description and price fields, and name can be pulled out of the response data for the given key. With that, we access the nested object in there, and then that nested object will have a name field, as I just showed you. We're now accessing this nested name field here, for example. And we don't just do that for the name, we also replicate this for the description here. And then also one more time for the price. Like that. And with that, we're transforming the fetched data. Now we need to expose that fetched data to the rest of our component, and we want to re-render the component once the fetching is done, because that's an asynchronous task which is only started after the component loaded for the first time, and therefore initially there will be no data, and we want to update the component once the data is there. Now, when we have data that changes and where a component should be re-evaluated once it did change, whenever we have a use case like this, we need state. So we should also import use state here from React, and then set up some state in this component by calling use state. And here we initially might have an empty array because this state will be our meals and the set meals state updating function. It's now the meals which I want to use down there instead of dummy meals to render the meal items. And initially that's an empty array again, but that will change once the loaded data is there. And therefore here after this for loop, once we filled our loaded meals helper constant here with the transformed data, I want to call set meals. So I want to call that state updating function and pass in the loaded meals. So that array which we populated here. With that, we're setting the data, and therefore then this component should update. Now for this useEffect function here, currently our dependency array is an empty array. So we have no dependencies, which means this useEffect function, this function here, will only run when the component was first loaded. It will never run again thereafter. And that sounds about right to me. We indeed have no dependencies in there. We're not using any external component-specific data. We're not using any props in there or anything like that. And therefore, only running this when the component is first loaded makes a lot of sense. So we don't need to change this dependencies array. And therefore, with all of that, if we save this, we go back to our project. If I reload, you see initially that list is empty, but then the data arrives quickly. Now, of course, we can show some loading spinner or some loading state instead if we want to, though currently the experience also isn't too bad, I would argue. But still, handling a loading state and a potential error state is something we're going to dive in next.